Hello and welcome to Thanatology Themes. I'm your host, Carolyn, therapist and thanatologist. So I'm really excited today. We're doing something really different, and we have a really great episode. So for me, this is new. I have a documentary filmmaker here and one of her participants. The name of the film is called I'm Still Here, Love, and we're going to talk about the significance of the title in just a little bit. So first, I'm going to introduce Meg Daniels. Director and cinematographer Meg Daniels has been telling people stories for over 25 years. After completing her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in photography and a Master of Science degree in adult and community college education, she became a photo essayist and filmmaker. Knowing that it was her responsibility to use her storytelling skills as a platform to raise awareness about social justice issues, both well-known and shrouded by secrecy, right? And this is reminding me of social work and some of the training I have as well. After receiving her Master's of Fine Arts degree in documentary filmmaking from Wake Forest, she began screening her first award-winning feature film, Proper Pronouns. It was in multiple film festivals, including Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival and the New Orleans Film Festival. It aired on PBS and North Carolina, NC, in November 2020 and was recently acquired by Prime Video and Tubi. Currently, Meg is an assistant professor in the Cinema and Television Arts program at Elon University. Her current film project, I'm Still Here, Love, we're going to talk about today. So I'm not going to go into too much about it just yet. I know we're going to talk about that. And then I want to introduce Jessica Watt Doherty, holds a master's degree in counseling from North Carolina State University, a certificate in violence, loss, and trauma from Marshall University, and has worked as an elementary school counselor for the past 2 decades. Yay. She works closely with children who have experienced trauma, grief, and loss, and for the past 2 years has found it necessary to support her students with a wide array of stress and difficult experiences, while schools have learned to navigate education throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. With the January 2022 death of her father, Randy, we're going to talk about, to COVID, Jessica now finds herself navigating the trauma and isolation of a COVID death in her own life. She has found that the connections she helps children make with the supportive people during life's hardships is now at the forefront of her own healing. And for this reason is passionate about making connections with others by telling her own story of loss, which is what this documentary is about, right? Jessica witnessed her father die alone, quite suddenly via her cell phone, not permitted to be by his side. And we're going to talk about that today. One of the last texts she ever received was, I'm still here, love. And we'll incorporate that into our conversation today. I do think it's important to say no. Jessica feels no one should have to face a tragedy such as this, but if you have to face it, you do not have to grieve and heal alone. We are all stronger together. Jessica is stronger because of the connection she is making as she mourns out loud and because of her family. Jessica resides in southeastern Ohio with her husband, Stephen, and their children, Jillian, Brendan, Maddie, and Benjamin. Which one is the guitarist?
That's Jillian.
That's Jillian. Okay. And that's in the film. Okay. So thank you both for being here. I think it would be helpful to kind of set the tone. And I think, Jess, if you can start a little bit with your dad, your dad is the relationship, right? We talk about attachment theory. What does that really mean? That's not just something we plop onto people. Oh, this comes from our heart, right?
Yes. Yes. Well, my parents had me when they were very young. My dad was 19 when I was born. So, 17 years later, when I became pregnant at 16, it was no surprise that he was very supportive of me during that very tumultuous time for myself and my family. In the film, I say that my dad gave me the best advice of my life, and I wasn't able to return the favor. And the best advice that he ever gave me was that it was my choice whether or not to keep that baby at such a young age, but that he and my mother intended to support me through it, to give me a home to live in, not to take the burden off of me, not to raise that child, but to be by my side and help hold me up and support me if that should be my decision. And I did decide to keep that baby, and that's Jillian. And she is also in the film. She's 30 now, and she's a beautiful, wonderful person that none of us could ever live without. And so my dad and my mom opened that door for me to be able to still have a loving home, to make the best out of a very difficult situation. So I could give you a lot of examples of what kind of a father my dad was, but that's probably the best example that I can give you. He was very loving. My dad was a very musical, cool man. I often call him a leftover hippie. He had a ponytail forever. There was a very short period in his life where he cut his hair short, but he always had long, wavy hair. And in his later years, it turned gray. And he was just a really cool father that spent time with us fishing, teaching us how to drive, shooting pellet guns, and we would go mudding in the car down by the ball fields. He loved to be outside, and he was just a good, safe person to have for a dad as a little girl and as an adult daughter.
Oh. So a lot of love, and you sound, really connected to him, really supported by him.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's jump forward a little bit. Did so that's when you were growing up, and then I know you stayed close with him, you had a good relationship. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what happened starting in the pandemic, or maybe the beginning of the pandemic and when COVID really?
Mhm. Um, we went into lockdown in March of 2020, right? So my dad took quarantining very seriously. I remember having lots of discussions with him where he would advise me, make sure you have all of your supplies, make sure you're ordering your groceries, staying inside, make sure you have 2 weeks worth of food in your freezer, like just in case these things happen, make sure you're taking these precautions, Jess, and advising like that. He didn't come to visit. He stayed home for 2 years that COVID was really bad. I mean, he only lived about 2 hours away from us. And he didn't come. We had a young son at the time, and he didn't want to risk bringing any germs into the house. And so, unfortunately, another loss that we had was that loss of time. 2 years of not seeing him face to face, and him not getting to interact with Benjamin, and Benjamin not getting to know him, because toddlers don't get to know people via social media. Even if you see someone FaceTime or talk on the phone, it's absolutely not the same in building memories for a little one. So that was the first loss. He was very careful. Early on, right as the vaccine started to roll out, I remember asking him if he was going to get vaccinated, and he said he was not going to get vaccinated. And I did not ever push that with him, because I did not question my father's authority. I just respected him. And early on, I wasn't even sure that that was the right decision. There was so many stories going around about whether or not it was safe, and nobody really knew what to do. But he stuck with that until it was much too late, that he didn't want to be vaccinated.
Okay. I wonder if now's a good time for Meg to jump in. You know, when I watched your documentary, you Meg, you bring up something really important that I don't even think I really realized, and I feel that I'm someone who's kind of knows what's going on, but you talked about the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And I think that's so important. Can you detail that for us? Explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So misinformation and disinformation are different. I didn't know as much about it either until the pandemic and the making of this film. Misinformation is the spread of information without the intent to harm. The information is not vetted. People don't know it's false, but it's spread nonetheless. I can say I 100% was that person accidentally. And my example all the time is with the surgical masks, right? I have a lot of loved ones who are part of the healthcare profession, and I didn't want other people taking the supplies that my loved ones needed when we could just wear something else, right? I'm not saying that I didn't mask, that isn't it at all, but I was wearing other scarves and wraps and anything else so that I could be a person who was making sure that all my loved ones and all the frontline workers had what they needed. I was one person, but hey, I was one person. So I accidentally spread misinformation in the beginning. Disinformation is different. It is false or misleading information with the intent to harm. And oftentimes it's a financial gain that people are after, excuse me, political endeavors, or just new followers on social media, right? Popularity.
Mhm.
So there was a big difference that we encountered as we went through the making of this film. And the film attempts to humanize what happened and not simplify. This is not a simple matter. These are not simple concepts by any means, but it attempts to simplify and humanize and give examples to what happens when we consume disinformation. And it's still rampant. It will always be rampant. Somebody will latch onto something else and lives will be lost. It may not be a pandemic again, but lives are going to be lost because of disinformation.
Yeah. Jess, did you want to add anything to that?
I do. I want to add that, is it too early to go into the role of disinformation in my father's death? Just coming off of Meg, I strongly believe that the platform that my father interacted with over time, called gab.com, provided disinformation to people. And the reason that it's not misinformation and disinformation is because Gab encourages people to have freedom of speech, to share all their thoughts and feelings, even though much of it is racist and hateful and untrue. And they do it under the premise of gaining popularity to build that platform, to get many members, and it is not free. And there are a lot of things being sold on it. And so that takes it up a level into dangerousness, into the arena of disinformation. And it's not being censored in any way. There's a lot of anti-Semitic, racist, horrible things being shared on there. And during COVID, there was a lot of misinformation about treatment and medication and things that actual medical communities and doctors say are not safe for people to take and dangerous for people to take and have no effect on saving you from COVID. And when people spend their time on that platform and they read it, that becomes part of their belief system. And that the vaccines were dangerous, that things like ivermectin could be used to safely treat it if you became sick with COVID. And if that is what you're surrounding yourself with, that becomes what you believe to be accurate information. And all of that was provided on Gab, all of that disinformation. Have you ever checked out Gab?
So I had never heard of Gab until you introduced me to it.
You'll have to get on. It's
Be prepared.
it's very enlightening
Be-
to the kind of people that are out there and how they feed off of each other.
They
That they're having a field day with this boxer in the Olympics. I haven't been on it in months because it makes me nauseous to get on that platform. But I bet they're having a field day with this woman in the Olympics that's being accused of being trans.
Okay, I didn't think. Okay.
Yeah, they
Mhm.
latch on, right? They
Mhm.
latch on to anything that they can, and the CEO takes that and runs with it, and then charges people to subscribe to a pro, I think it is, a pro level.
Mhm.
So there is monetary gain in every move that he makes, right?
Mhm.
So they create these subliminal and subtle messages that people internalize, sometimes consciously or unconsciously, right? And they're savvy and they see it as an opportunity to capitalize on disinformation with the intention of gaining popularity with new followers and construct this reality that affects all classes and races and genders. And,
Mhm.
you know, there's their financial gain. I
Mhm.
don't know what else motivates them other than hatred and money. They're dangerous primary forces that,
Mhm.
you know, that social media can become, and they shape what we believe in. And it's not just Gab. Gab
No.
is one of the, Facebook, and I mean, people can just hide behind a screen and hide behind a keyboard, and oftentimes financial gain is the end result. From what I have seen in my research, popularity and financial gain, I can't get around those two motivators.
So I just want to add, I know we talk about frontline workers, and I say I was a backline worker. So I was doing hospice during the day and therapy at night. And here in Brooklyn, I was dealing with dead bodies piling up. So when I hear about this kind of, disinformation, it's so upsetting. I think it's upsetting for many people. And certainly, I really saw a lot of it firsthand. So, I hear what you're saying. I mean, certainly this kind of speech, that line between free speech and hate speech, is really something we all have to talk about. And when it comes, people lost their lives,
Mhm.
so this is, of course, like really, um, you know, when we're empathetic and we have compassion and we come from this place, this is really like, really, really deep sadness, Just, do you want to talk about, and I don't know if we're jumping ahead a little bit, we just jumped into Gab Social. Do you want to connect though that with your dad?
Sure. We were not aware that my dad was active on the platform Gab Social until after his death. My sister had done some research looking into his activity because my dad's widow um, had mentioned that that was something that he was participating in, spending a lot of time on this platform, and found his account. And we we were just able to dive into seeing why he was so against the vaccine and why he was questioning the information that the government and media was sharing about how to be safe about COVID. He was really caught in the crossfire of A or B. A lot of people believe that COVID was a real threat and that it was necessary to get vaccinated. And a lot of people believe the opposite. And a lot of people weren't sure what to believe, somewhere in the middle. And although I feel like my dad started off here believing that it was a real threat, I do very much believe that the information he was taking in via Gab brought him over here, and he questioned the reality. He questioned the reality of the pandemic, of COVID itself. And then, of course, the vaccine was seen as a jab and something that it wasn't safe to receive, some kind of a ploy from the government to take control, to cause people harm. And he fell into that trap of lies that was being presented to him. Now, I don't believe that my dad was an easily coerced person, any kind of a pushover. He was a very well-educated man who spent almost 40 years in the same career. He built himself from a maintenance worker into much higher levels of the company, with a very wonderful, successful career that he had just retired from about a year and a half before the pandemic hit. And so he was political. He did question authority. He had a pipeline going in across his property, behind his house, within like 1,000 feet. And he and his neighbors hired attorneys and tried to fight that. There's a link in the New York Times article to a song that he wrote that's illustrated through like a cartoon-like video about fighting back against things. It's fighting back against the pipeline, but my dad would fight back against anything that he didn't believe was right, and he would be verbal about it, and he would take it, which is what I feel like I'm doing with this film, is following in his footsteps. But he did fall into that trap, and I think that because I know he was not a gullible person, we were all in such a tender, fragile state when we were isolated. There was a lot of information coming from all over, and none of it matched. We were living in a state of fear and panic. Being isolated for months in our homes was traumatic in and of itself. And so my dad had just gone from having a very full life where he worked every day and was a very social person that would go out and play gigs and be in public and had a big friend circle, to being isolated and newly retired. And so he was looking for connection. And I think that he just found himself in that very vulnerable place where he found something that he was searching for. And unfortunately, it was the wrong connection to make, a very dangerous connection to make. And so when he finally let us know right before Christmas of 21 that he was sick, he didn't even want to go to the hospital. He didn't even know if he tested for COVID, if it would be the truth, like if they would tell him if he really had it or not, or if it was just something they were doing to collect for numbers. But he did go and he did test positive. And then it was just 12 days later that he had already died. So it all happened really, really fast. It was just a tornado of emotions and chaos and fear, feeling stuck, not having a say, not being able to do anything, just sitting and watching and waiting as everything unraveled in a horrible chain of events.
Meg, do you want to add anything right now?
Yeah, I think this might be, like we talked about earlier, a good chance to touch on the concept of cognitive dissonance. Because just like Jess said, he was I knew Randy. Jess lived across the street from me in our 20s. And I just, I too was as shocked. I mean, Jess and her sister, obviously more so, but I too was shocked when they found out that he was participating in this extremist social media platform. So when I read about cognitive dissonance and it being the human psychological, emotional discomfort that we all experience when we're presented with evidence that's inconsistent with or even directly challenges information that, people whom we trust, whom we idolize, it's inconsistent with what we think as the truth, right? So, excuse me, it contradicts the misinformation that we've received from loved ones. And this led to the dismissal of reliable, scientifically proven methodologies, studies, data, Fauci. And, those who were relaying this reliable information were dismissed very quickly. We couldn't participate, like Jess said, in in-person conversations in our social circles. And of course, we know when you're in deep conversations with people people whom you do trust, you can read body language, right? And you can push the conversation when there are emotional responses to it. And these visible reactions can oftentimes promote self-reflection. And we didn't have that. None of us, not just Randy, but none of us had that. So, the cognitive dissonance that occurred, people wouldn't sit with that discomfort that was caused by this new vetted information. They were more comfortable with disinformation. So, that really resonated me within the context of this film. And it's something that I discovered after the making of the film. And, I guess, like I said, I'm late to the party because I would have loved to have addressed that phenomenon, that concept, and how it applied to the pandemic. But, I'm a late bloomer.
It's much easier to latch on to the theory that COVID is a hoax and that it's not real than to believe something that of that magnitude is actually happening in real life. Yeah, it feels safer.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of it is, it was terrible to be isolated. It absolutely was, 100%. And so and not having your life, and not being able to do the things that we just do. And this piece, how you added your dad had just retired. A couple I work with, I'm now a therapist in private practice, and sometimes I'll be working with people who are grieving and they just retired or getting ready to retire, which is a huge life stage. It's a huge,
Yeah.
your dad worked for 40 years, And so, like you said, that socialization, that sense of community, all these things were already gone or changing. And then the pandemic hit. This is probably a really big, I mean, just retiring for many people is like, whoa, so that was a huge lot, it's a
It was
huge,
the perfect storm for him.
yeah, perfect
Yeah.
story. And you also said something really insightful. Gap Social and a lot of these platforms create the sense of community for people, right? Or a false sense of community for people, or maybe an unhealthy sense of community for people, but they still think it's like socialization or community, right?
Yes.
And there's something, yeah, very, oh, we think that's helpful. And then, parts of it are very harmful, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah, so these are all really important pieces. So tell us a little bit about, I mean, 12 days is certainly, you know, yeah, a whirlwind and, emotionally. I mean, will you share a little bit about it?
I will. So he drove himself to the emergency room the day after Christmas in 21. And he was tested and texted that he was positive for COVID. He had been sick for quite some time before that. He had had some respiratory problems and had a cough for at least a month before he got really sick. He actually did one journal entry on his Gab account to his illness, and recounts all of that information and how he had been treating himself. So before he went to the hospital, he was taking a regimen of vitamins and treating himself with ivermectin at home and continuing to feel worse and worse. So he actually told me that it was me begging him and telling him how scared I was that finally put him over the edge to taking himself into a hospital to be checked. So he did that, and then he was transported to a COVID unit at a local hospital from that emergency room in the next 24 hours. And he never left the hospital. It was about 6 days and maybe 7, and he was then admitted into ICU. During that time, we texted and FaceTimed constantly. We did a lot more texting than FaceTime. And I have to tell you that that is not, absolutely not the way that anyone should have to say goodbye to a family member. And I know that it happened to millions of people. At that time, Ohio was in a very huge Omicron surge, and my dad was in Akron City hospitals, and they were closed. They were closed to, you weren't allowed to go in and visit unless you were sick, and it was made very clear early on that nobody would be called in it until death was imminent, if it came to that point. And even at that moment, only one person would be permitted to go be by his side. So the same day that my dad, or the day after my dad was put into intensive care, I actually tested positive for COVID myself. And I am at home with a 3-year-old and my husband, and it's early January, and I decided to isolate myself in our basement rec room, hoping that they wouldn't get sick. They both ended up getting COVID, but they were okay. I was vaccinated, so my symptoms were pretty mild, but I did spend Monday through Friday, the day he died, in isolation in my basement. So it was really interesting to me. And at the time I was really angry because I really needed my husband and I needed my daughter. I needed my family, and I was by myself in the basement facing all of this information. Lots of text and phone calls with my dad's wife, with my sister, with my daughter, and then with my father, trying to make sense of what was going on via that platform. It was very difficult. Not being able to talk to any doctors, and knowing that my father was gravely ill and the only in-person being to be the one advocating for his own health. I can't imagine being hit with COVID and getting that sick that fast, and also trying to navigate the medical side of your own care while you're actively dying, while you know you're probably going to die. And his anxiety was through the roof. He would give him things, they would give him things to calm him down, but then that would make him sleepy, and then he wouldn't be awake or aware enough to feel like he was participating in making decisions about his own healthcare. So it was just a whole combination of things that I feel were chaotic and wrong and just a disservice. And then any communication with doctors, which I never had any personally myself, but that his wife, my daughter, is a physician's assistant. And at the time she was working in cardiology and vascular health and very exposed and well-versed on what COVID was doing to patients in her own care, made a couple phone calls to try to talk with people, but it was all over the phone. And those medical workers were so taxed and exhausted. And Jillian talks about it a little bit in the film about what it was like to watch families go through that from a medical perspective and to watch patients die alone. They were so, just as a medical community, exhausted that I feel like the conversations that were happening over the phone weren't meaningful or helpful all the time. So there was a lot going on. The day that my dad did die, he died late at night. It was after 10:30 at night, sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m. I was supposed to break my quarantine the next day on Saturday, but I ended up breaking it that evening because he was dying and I needed my husband. And my daughter was like, I don't care, I'm coming over. And so we were able to be together. And then the hospital called and allowed his wife to go in and be by his side. And I'm so glad that he wasn't all by himself. I would have done anything to be permitted to be there, to hold his hand, to give him a kiss, and to see him before he passed. It is cruel and unfair, and I don't know how anyone ever gets over knowing that somebody suffered all by themselves for so long. It's not a place I allow myself to go to. And I was actually really nervous about doing this because I knew I was going to go to these places. And I was like, oh, I probably thought in the last 48 hours about emailing you guys and canceling this like a dozen times, because it's something that you do suppress. You push it down. You don't want to face that. My dad died on FaceTime for me, and that's not normal. And that's not okay. And something that was important to me in the beginning of telling this story through film was I wanted people to know who had also experienced this, that the feelings we have of closure and any kind of peace that we're trying to achieve, that you're not able to get there, it's okay that we all feel that way. I should never have had to see my father's dead body on the screen of my phone. And that's an image that for many, many months after his death that I would see when I would close my eyes at night to go to sleep. Extremely traumatic. We were able to say a lot of goodbyes and share memories and talk about things and love on one another through text. And as time has gone on, I've tried to reframe the anger and trauma of being isolated alone in the basement and not getting to be with him face to face into something positive. One positive is that I do have all those words written and I can look at them anytime I want to. I mean, it's not just a conversation that I have a memory of, but it's a concrete text that I can go back and see. And that's beautiful. I also have come to realize that if I had not gotten COVID myself and been isolated in the basement, I would not have had time to be so present during that week, because I would have been back to work. I work as an elementary school counselor. I would have worked all day long and then come home and done my family's routine. And so I would have had a lot of those precious moments that did end up happening because I was laying on the couch sick myself. Those wouldn't have occurred in the time that they did. And so if you try really hard to look at things differently, you can find a way maybe to feel blessed by some of these things. Of course, if I could go back and change it and be on my dad's side, that's what I would have preferred happened. But you have to find a way to make it okay with your heart. And that's what I've found, is that because everything was so backwards at that time in our lives, and for everyone who went through it, things happened really fast. They didn't make any sense. It was terrifying and confusing. But that we are not alone, that it helps to try to find if there's anything good out of it. And although there have been a lot of bad things that have happened in my life because of my choice to tell this story so publicly, one of the good things I know is that I've connected with so many people in the COVID loss community that get this. And unless you have lived it and had COVID affect your life in a very significant way, it's just not something that you have to get. You might choose to get it, you might choose to understand, but unless it's impacted you in a significant way through having COVID or long COVID or losing friends and family, loss of job, business, income, homes, unless it's hit you big, you're probably existing in pre-COVID normal in your mind, your heart, and your soul now. And there are just so many of us that absolutely are not there yet. And it's hard to exist in a world where most people are there, because there is absolutely not a week in my life that goes by where at least one time I do not hear somebody refer to COVID in a way that makes me sick to my stomach, because it's dismissive and they have no idea who I am or what I've been through or how hard I'm working to make sure people don't feel like they've been forgotten through the making of this film. But it's very hard to exist in a world where people do not know. I mean, if I walked around telling everyone that cancer wasn't real and people didn't really die of cancer, I would offend people everywhere I went. And that's what happens with so many of us in regards to COVID. I know I'm going on, and I know you won't use all of that, but I just want to end that by giving you an example. I went back in June, and Meg, I have not shared this story with you. I have actually talked with Lydia about it. We talked on the phone a couple weeks ago because she had an incident that happened to her at her place of work over a mask. And she called me because she was really upset about what happened. And it's those kinds of things that people don't realize. You're throwing a fit about wearing a mask to a woman whose son died of COVID. Like, people don't get it. And I just went and got a tattoo. And I was in the tattoo parlor, and really cool guy giving me my new ink, and a family, 3 sisters came in, and they were it was a double room. There were 2 stalls for tattoo, and they said, do you mind if we bring some people in? They're getting a real quick tattoo, 3 of them, they'll be in and out. And I was like, no, that's great, bring them in, it'll give me someone to talk to, because my tattoo was 3 hours long and it was pretty painful. And so I appreciated the distraction. And so these 3 women came in, they were sisters, and they were all excited because it was right before Father's Day, which is now a holiday that I don't enjoy yet. Again, it's very bittersweet. And they were getting a tattoo of their father's signature on their arms together. And I was like, oh, instantly intrigued, thought that was very sweet. And I asked, is your dad still with us? And I could tell by the way they were talking that he was. And they said, yes, this is our Father's Day gift to him. And I was like, that is so absolutely precious. And we chatted. And then just randomly, one of the tattoo artists, after he's finishing them up, but they're still in the room, he said, well, I'm going to get cleaned up and get home because my significant other isn't feeling well. And my tattoo artist says, is she not feeling well, like depression, or is she sick? And he said, she's sick, and named some of her symptoms. And he said, she doesn't have COVID, does she? And he said, no, she took a test. She doesn't have COVID. And I thought, here we go. COVID's coming up. Everywhere I go, it comes up all the time. And one of the women that was in there getting her tattoo, she had on scrubs. She was in the medical field. And she was like, oh, good Lord, COVID. And my tattoo artist goes, right? Seriously, the biggest hoax of our lifetime. And I was like, oh, I can't go anywhere without somebody saying something ignorant and they don't even know. And so I just like tensed up. Those women left and I got really quiet. I could feel when I get emotional, I get red, like that. My décolleté, my face, red. And I could feel it. I knew I was burning. And he was like, are you okay? Do you need like a drink? And I was like, you know, my dad died of COVID. And he was like, oh. And I was like, yeah. So it's just, that is something that I want people to take away, is that we need to be careful. To the old adage, think before we speak. We have to. So that's my most current, it's not even my most current example. That's just a good example.
I'm in shock. I don't know why I am, because with the making of this film, the things that the stories I've heard from all of you, and I just, and that's one of the things I don't know if you have time, Lydia. Sorry, I don't know if you have time, Carolyn. I was just thinking of the phone call that you and Lydia had, and I'm so glad she called you. And that's what I was going to say first, but
because she knew no one else would get it.
right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, she said to us on our last call that, she doesn't even tell her story anymore. And I wondered if, I know you wanted to talk about disenfranchised grief, Carolyn, because that's something that we address in the film. And maybe if you still have time, this might be the perfect chance, because society is dismissing these deaths. And that's something that we literally define in the film with an animation. And Lydia speaks very eloquently about it in her role as a participant, because the first questions out of people's mouths are, well, were they sick? Did they have a pre-existing condition? Were they vaccinated? It's like, you don't ask those questions.
I wasn't even back to work for 5 minutes after returning from my father's death. And I was already offended by somebody's comment to me. Where you been? Well, my father passed away. Oh, what happened? He passed away from COVID. Oh, was he vaccinated? No. Well, that's good, because he probably would have died from that damn vaccine anyways. Like within 5 minutes of walking back into my place of work, people celebrating, yes, we don't have to wear masks to work anymore. God, I hope they don't close us down again. Just those kinds of things just they're hurtful to hear.
I think you bring up a really, it is a really true point in what you said about, cancer. COVID has become, it is true. I think a lot of people will use the word like politicized, right? And, I worked in hospice for almost 10 years, and people had, certainly cancer, but there were other, heart disease and many different things, right? And as you're saying, COVID is just this completely different, where people feel like it's okay to have their opinion or say these kinds of things, or never would have said about any of these other, or even around death and dying in general, I don't think, or specific, or, hospice or these kind, this is like a whole new place where people
Mhm.
just feel they can say these things. And as you're saying, it's so hurtful, and I hear you, there's so many people who lost loved ones. I also think for a lot of healthcare workers, for many people, COVID isn't ever over or quite over, right?
Yeah.
And so there's another dissonance, this kind of cultural dissonance or macro dissonance in the country, I think, of like some people have kind of, we're either people are in it or there's people like Meg who are aware or compassionate. And then as you're saying, there's other people who kind of moved on, right?
Mhm.
And I feel like that's also, that piece is there too.
I wish I could move on so easily. I would prefer not to be in this category of people.
I just want to add, and it doesn't compare at all to what, people like yourself have lost someone. I was one of the like me and Neil Young were the only people who got off Spotify. Like there was this for 5 minutes. Do you remember this? There was like, don't be on Spotify. And I was a healthcare worker, and it was because of the misinformation that they were spreading. And I was like, I'm gonna, and nobody, it was like I said, it was me and Neil Young and two other people, which is fine. But to this day, I kind of hold this grudge. I'm holding something about, I'm like, I'm on Apple Music, and it's where I'm not going to move on. I don't know. I can't forgive them. It's my thing. I don't know.
I love that you brought up Neil Young. So Neil Young was my dad's jam. And when my dad sang, I personally think he sounds like Neil Young. And there is not a time when Neil Young doesn't come on that I am not instantly transported to my childhood, and my father. So that is really cool that you just brought up all the examples you could have given. You brought up Neil Young.
I mean, he was the guy. He was the one kind of leading that, and I look up to him too. So we do have a few minutes. Can we move a little bit into disenfranchised grief, like you just said? That's I don't know, Jess, Meg, I don't know who wants to kind of start with that.
Disenfranchised grief is something that I encounter quite a bit in my field. There there are a lot of tragic deaths in today's society, whether it is a drug overdose or suicide, just to give two examples. And when those kinds of things happen, it's very hard and sad to watch the families navigate saying goodbye and grieving that particular kind of loss, because those kinds of losses are often dismissed by society. What's the right word? They're dismissed as
Invalid,
unnecessary.
invalid.
Yeah, yes.
They're
People
not validated.
yeah, people invalidate those kinds of deaths because it's such a controversial way that a person dies. If somebody has a substance use problem and they die of an overdose, well, they were a crackhead. Or if somebody suffers from mental illness and they end their own life, if they complete a suicide, then that's it's very difficult for a family to come public with that kind of information because it's so scrutinized. And on top of the loss and the shock that you're experiencing, having something that tragic happen within your family, you are dealing with a lot of scrutiny from society. And
Can I
that is definitely something that I feel like happens when you have someone die with COVID.
I just wanted to jump in because in our handbook of thanatology, we do talk about disenfranchised grief. And I'm gonna say I met Ken Doka is the therapist who came up with the theory. But I want to say that I think, just to add to your point, it feels like there's almost almost the person is like responsible for their own death, right? And or
Mhm.
there's this judgment that it was their fault, maybe
Mhm.
they were responsible. So I just wanted to add that piece because I think that's part of it, right? That, oh, it
Yes.
was their fault. And then that judgment piece must feel for the loved ones, they feel that judgment. Just one.
And either side of my father's death, somebody can blame him, whether it's, well, he wasn't vaccinated, so that's what he gets, or he took ivermectin, and that didn't work, or he was treated with the medications he was treated with, and the government really made those to kill people. No matter which way you look at it, somebody on either side is saying that there was some kind of fault of him or some kind of conspiracy theory that led to it, which just undermines the actual loss itself. And I, like Lydia, do not often talk about it with people. It is very difficult. I don't like to make people feel uncomfortable. And when I do mention that my father passed from COVID, I watch people squirm. And then that makes me feel regretful for even being open about it. So there's no good way around it. It's just hard. And choosing to make this film has compounded a lot of that because it is very public. And I have talked to a lot of people, from other grievers, to politicians, to reporters all over the world, to all kinds of people that I've been connected to, and rehashing it over and over and over again. But it has been worth the scrutiny and worth the side eye and worth watching people squirm, because most importantly, there's been so many connections made with people that I really need to be connected with in order to heal from an ordeal like this.
Meg, did you want to add anything about disenfranchised grief?
From the filmmaker's perspective, I mean, Jess summarized everything that I have learned and I have watched them go through, because, Jess and I text weekly, if not daily, multiple times a day sometimes. And Lydia also, and the stories that I hear from them. I mean, just this tattoo story, which I haven't heard yet. It's heartbreaking. And I think that's where, again, we come back to the cognitive dissonance, because people can't sit with their discomfort and the fact that this horrific tragedy occurred in a first world country. I mean, it's like, how the hell did we let this happen? And it all comes back to, for me personally, money and social media popularity. I mean, yes, I embrace, as a filmmaker, as a former photojournalist, as, a professor, I embrace and fight for our First Amendment rights. 100%. But there's got to be something that we do to curb and get a handle on this disinformation. Misinformation is going to happen. And like we said in the beginning, it is not intended to harm. It is just the fact that we haven't vetted where we got our information from and the source where we obtained it. And those sources may not, they also are not intending to harm, but there are sources out there and people out there and organizations out there and the Gab socials out there who are doing just that. And, just watching and hearing these stories, that was one of the reasons we really needed to address this in the film. Is, like Jess said, people have to think before they speak. We need to be a more compassionate society, from what people have gone through and continue to go through. For many people, I mean, the pandemic has quieted down. I'm not going to say that it can't ramp back up. I wore a mask on the plane flying to and from Boston. We have multiple people we know who have COVID again. And the strain is going to change, and long COVID, is a real thing. And, but people can't sit with that because it scares the hell out of them. So they want to dismiss it, and they want to dismiss other people's grief and invalidate it and blame, because that's easier than sitting with your discomfort.
Yeah, very insightful. Yeah. Jess, do you want to talk for a minute about the annual grief event at your school?
Oh, I'd love to. The year after my father passed, after working with students in the aftermath of his death, after working with students in grief groups, which I often hold for children who have experienced loss in school to support them through that time and to connect with their peers, I decided that it was on my heart to offer the community in which I am a school counselor a chance to come together, and I was hoping it would be annually, to just recognize their mental health. And grief is a part of that. Any kind of loss, change, stress, and definitely loss through death is recognized at this event. And so I wanted to do it in memory of my dad, Randy, but nobody I work with knows who Randy Watt is. So I couldn't call it the Randy Watt mental health vigil. That wouldn't make sense. And so I played around with the words, and I thought about what our purpose would be. And I decided that I wanted to use words that started with the letter R in honor of my dad. And what I wanted people to come together to do was to remember, reflect, and release. And so I got connected with a local funeral home, with our local chapter of NAMI, and with help of our lovely little student council members. We have for 2 years in a row now been able to host Remember, Reflect, Release, a vigil with Madison Elementary School. And we have families come and we talk about loss. And this year we incorporated different mindfulness stations, and our families were able to go around and do activities that exposed them and hopefully planted the seed of some healthy activities that they could take home with them and continue to do throughout the year to help themselves stay healthy mentally and emotionally. And it's just really beautiful to see people come together and to get the feedback from the parents and the kids. I talk to the adults and I share with them, I do this every day with your children, but I don't often stop and take the time to make sure I'm doing it for myself. And I know it's like that for parents too. As a parent myself, we take care of our kids. We don't often stop to sit with our own feelings, to just be mindful of what we're going through. We're so busy and going through the motions. I think one of the most valuable things I learned from attending a grief group myself was that as a busy working mother in today's day and age, it would be very healthy for me to schedule time to grieve in the days following my dad's death. And I did that intentionally, 15 minutes, just go into the bedroom or go into a room by myself and just take time to be present with those feelings and not let the busyness of the world roll over them. And I remind parents that it's important to take these activities and bring them into your normal circle of routine, because that's what helps keep you healthy throughout the year. And so we did gardening and coloring, and we had sand art, we had a bubble release, we had beautiful music by our choral group at the school, and shared a meal together. And there's nothing more intimate than sharing a meal together and sitting down and talking over pasta. So it's wonderful. And so we've done it 2 years in a row, and I fully intend on continuing to do it. We've done it in May during Mental Health Awareness Month, and it's just very special. And what an awesome way for me to continue in my heart to honor the memory of my father, and making sure I'm giving myself, even though I know it's more than once a year, but I'm really giving myself a significant moment in time, coming together with other families who are hurting, and all just feeling blessed by being in the presence of one another. Um, it's really probably one of the coolest things I've done as a school counselor, and I've been in education for 25 years. So that in mentoring is the coolest thing I've ever done. So
Well, I'll say it's the coolest thing for sure. And I just want to say, I think it's so important and so meaningful. I work often with people who come to me in their early 30s who lost a parent young, and which wasn't that long ago, but even 15 years ago, these kids didn't get the support they needed. And it just still shocks me to this day, is like, so, really supporting kids through these kinds of things, I know you age appropriately, is so they don't wake up at 30 and be like, yeah, no one ever talked to me about this or, these kinds of things.
It's incredible how easy it is to normalize taking care of your mental health with children. If it's just part of what we do and they don't know any different. And from preschool through 5th grade at our school, they receive that kind of an education, that social emotional education. And it's just incredible that, I'm having big feelings, I'm going to go talk with a counselor. Like it's just the normal thing to do. It's not looked down on, it's not stigmatized in any way. It's definitely my passion. I could go on and on and on about being an elementary school counselor and the wonderful things we have going on in our little urban school. But it's truly amazing. And reminding the kids, like, being in this 8-week long group is not going to end your grief. It's not going to fix everything, but it gives you tools to use. And in reminding parents that as the children grow and develop in their perspective and understanding of death and its finality changes, and that they're going to continue to need support, but in different ways as they grow and they develop. Not everybody realizes that. So I always knew I was doing good work, but now that I've really been through a traumatic loss, it's very, very important and a part of my passion now.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Yay, Madison Elementary School.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you both. We've covered so many really big topics, and I know there's even a lot more to talk about. I don't know if there was something that we wanted to say just as a wrap up. Meg, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what Jess was just saying, or bring in something as a wrap up.
I just would love for people to, I'm not trying to make a plug. I'm not making any money on this film. But we'd love for people to visit the website and learn more about it, because there's more information on there. We're starting to try to compile resources eventually. That'll take time because the film, hopefully, fingers crossed, we're going to have our first online 48-hour access to stream it. I don't want to say the date yet because we're finishing up a couple of last things with the color, and we have to purchase insurance for the film, but hopefully the end of August, we're going to have our first online access to stream it for 48 hours. We'll have the information on our website, which is imstillherlovefilm.com, for people who hopefully want to see, all of these wonderful participants who are using their story to make a difference in the world. That's the point, right? This is Jess's form of, all of them is, this is a form of advocacy work for all of them. They're putting themselves out there. they're not just complaining on Facebook. You know, they are actually doing things, as you saw. The barbers are using their platform to connect with the Black and Brown community. So there, you know, there are some really wonderful moments in the film where, you know, this is not all about COVID. This is about how we are trying to tackle and respect free speech, but also, you know, somehow consider containment. And then, you know, how all of these, you know, our three main participants, four main participants are using their voices to make a difference, and they are offering suggestions in the film as how to do so. So, you know, that's my mini plug, just to visit and stay tuned, because we're hoping that, you know, with your gracious time, Carolyn, in giving us this opportunity, not to only address the important topics, which was, of course, the priority, but also to see the film and maybe sit with your discomfort and reflect and learn that, you know, there are people out there just like you suffering, but there are people out there who really need to rethink that age-old adage, like Jess said. You have to think before you speak, because for most of us, COVID was real, is real, and is still a threat.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm Still Here, Love is your film, and we are going to be showing a trailer. You know, I think that is a really important, you know, and well, Jess, I want to say thank you so much for sharing. And it is important, as you said, that we're going to kind of continue this advocacy piece, right? And certainly a film is a big part of it. Jess, did you want to add anything?
I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to continue to share my story. And honestly, every time I talk about this and I know somebody else is going to feel heard, it does help me continue to heal, although it's hard. We do not get stronger by being weak. We have to fight through the hard stuff. So I really appreciate you continuing, or you allowing me to continue to process what's happened.
We're
Well,
so grateful. We just, yes, I just want to add to the, you know, the gratitude that we feel, Carolyn. Excuse me, I'm having all of a sudden this tickle. Just that, you know, how grateful we are for your interest in the film, your interest in the stories, and for allowing us time and taking, you know, all the time that you did to prepare for this. We're very grateful. We know what goes into it. So thank you so very much.
yeah, and I think, you know, I do agree with you. We don't want to just push it into the darkness. We want to bring it out into the light, right? There was I did a training with a somatic therapist, and they said, you know, what we push down kind of rots, or, you know, but what we bring out can kind of grow, or kind of, you know, when we show it the light. And I think that's true for healing, for grief, for all of these things, you know. So talk